Everyone. Welcome back to the third and final session for this for today. Those of you who may just be arriving, welcome. Those of you who have been here all day, welcome back. And thank you so much for the participants who have already spoken. This has been a really truly illuminating and engaging conversation so far. I have only two notes. One is if you require translation in either language, we are providing it. I hope you already have your translation device. If you need one, please just raise your hand. And secondly, a change from the practice we've had for the last two sessions. For this session, we will in fact be taking questions from the floor. And there are our assistants, ushers will be holding microphones, one on each side, is it? Front and the back, okay. So if you wish to pose a question when we get to that part of the program, please just raise your hand, and Jorge Castañeda will, as our moderator, will call on you. I am not going to do any long introduction, but simply to say we are enormously honored and grateful to have two very distinguished guests speaking to us this afternoon. Jorge Castañeda has a long biography, which you can read, but suffice to say for now, he's former Minister of Mexico. He is a global professor of politics and Latin American studies here at NYU. We feel enormously fortunate to have him come spend some time with us every year, and he will be serving as moderator for today's event. And I am also very, very honored and grateful, Ambassador Pickering, Thomas Pickering, that you have made time in your busy schedule to talk with us today. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass things over to the two of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. What Ambassador Pickering and I thought we'd do is try to convince him to reflect on different stages of his involvement with El Salvador. It's his first incarnation as ambassador there, nearly towards the beginning of the war. The war began in 1980, 1983 to 85, if I understand correctly. And my first sort of question or provocation would be, you arrived there in the middle of the Central American Cold War. You arrived, President Reagan had been in office barely a couple of years. He took office in January of 81, right after the first final offensive by the FMLN. There were several final offensives. They like to do that repeatedly. It's like the U.S. in Vietnam, the final battle. You arrived in the most intense moment, in a sense, of the Central American Cold War. The Contras were being armed, beginning their fight in Honduras and Nicaragua. The FMLN was beginning its arming transformation from a popular movement into an army. What did the place look like to you when you got there, and for the 2 years you were there, given that you were not really, in that sense, a Cold Warrior diplomat? You were sort of, did it make a lot of sense to draw a line in the sand in El Salvador at that moment, in that country with these people? Was it really that necessary, and were you absolutely convinced of it?
Jorge, thanks. Not to burn time, but let me tell you how I came to take the job. I was in Nigeria. I was in London for medical treatment, very minor. And at 6 o'clock in the evening in my hotel room, the Deputy Secretary of State called me and said, "We'd like you to go to El Salvador." And I almost said, "Are you out of your mind?" But I didn't. But I said, "I'm not really interested." And my wife was with me, and I hung up. And I said, if they're really interested, Larry Eagleburger, my old friend, would be on the phone. And less than a half an hour, Larry called me. And I said, "Larry, I've thought about this. I'm not really interested, but I would like to talk to Secretary Schultz if you're really serious about you wanting me to take this job. And Larry said, your tickets are at the embassy. So I got in a plane, went to see George Schultz the next morning. We had 2-hour-long conversations. His thinking was exactly my thinking. It's time to get rid of kind of Reagan ideas that Salvador is a dagger pointed at the heart of Texas, ready to be launched at a moment's notice, and that the whole U.S. was ready to fall to a communist onslaught launched from the woods on the border of Honduras and El Salvador. But that we had huge and complicated problems, some of our own making and some obviously to deal with an intense civil war that didn't show any signs of letting up, and where, in effect, America was deeply divided, and that there was no way of dealing with this unless we were prepared to deal with the combination of Salvadoran current insufficiencies, human rights violations, and all of the messiness that went with that. Early on, it was my impression that this was not a winnable war, probably not on both sides, but I had so little contact with the FMLN that I was not sure what they thought. But in every sense of the word, it was a mess. 2 or 3 brief remarks. I arrived in early September at the beginning of what was then a very successful multiple attack offensive of the FMLN against the Salvadoran military. 2 or 3 things happened. The country was almost cut in half. A number of units not well trained in the Northeast were badly mauled. And I think at the end of that period, in which the offensive ran its course, my friends in the FMLN will have to tell me, they were more exhausted than almost the Salvadoran government was, but both were pretty badly exhausted. And the whole rest of my time, we had no sustained multiple engagement offensive of main force elements against each other. We had a lot of very successful attacks of fixed targets at quite long intervals. But the war droned on, and there were many things that were done. We can talk about that if you want to, but it seemed to me that it was not, in that regard, a proposition which was going anywhere. And Duarte was elected, and I spent a lot of time with Duarte. He told me before he went up north to Las Palmas that he was doing this. I checked it out with Washington. I said I was highly favorable, and within a few hours I got a call back saying, please convey it to Duarte, which I did. Duarte seems to have forgotten that in his biography, probably conveniently so. But nevertheless, it was something we thought was the beginning of an opportunity. And I think that's sort of a long time, because this was probably 84. It was a long time before this bore any real fruit, despite the fact that there were some continued contacts going on over a period of time. Final point, I guess, on my side, it was a difficult time. We'd been through several elections. They had proved, one, that Duarte could get elected, but he couldn't control the assembly. That we had the beginning of perhaps more cooperation on the government side than they had seen before. But it was no question at all that Duarte and Arena were oil and water. And it was very difficult to see how much would be accomplished in that combination. And I suppose we played a stronger role in trying to push oil and water together than normally we should or would have, but it was clearly a question of that or things falling into pieces again. And that was difficult. My job was interesting because I was trying to reach out in all directions. Father Ellacuría was hard to meet, but not impossible. And I found him a remarkably useful contact. And I think he was interested in what the U.S. was thinking. And I was confident that if I had an indirect, put it this way, opportunity to convey views to the other side, he was probably as good a person as I could find. And so we spent some time together from time to time working in this direction. That was not my full-time occupation, of course. Full-time occupation was doing a lot of other things that I think in one way or another played a role.
That would sort of lead me to your description, Tom. What was the evolution, even though you left, I think, in 85?
I did. Mm-hmm.
Between 85 and 89, when in a sense the negotiations began, before we get to that part. What happened after you left? But obviously the war continued. Some talks continued, but not really much happened between 85 and 89 in terms of negotiations or in terms of the U.S. reassessing the famous line in the sand.
Yeah.
Because as you were saying, you had to sort of de-Reaganize perhaps when you arrived there, but President Reagan was still around till 88. And although Secretary Shultz was much more flexible and broad-minded on these issues than Secretary Haig had been, the fact is that Shultz was Reagan was his boss, and as much as he trusted Shultz and everything, this was still the Reagan administration and continued to be so.
Two points, Jorge. I was in Israel. I had a full-time job.
Apparently, U.S. ambassadors in Israel do have to actually go to work.
It's a full-time job.
Yeah, they do have to go to work.
And it's about as far as you get from Central America without coming back the other way around. So I had as little as possible to do with it, except that Iran-Contra ended up in my lap.
It wasn't that far away.
No, I mean, Israel was directly involved, as you know. And I was, in my own way, indirectly involved in Iran-Contra, too. But I had no opportunity to follow, and I'm delighted to have your assurance that nothing really serious took place, because I came to the UN in February of '89. And then sometime after that, Alvaro had, I guess, gotten his sheep in and out of New York at various times. And I had various conversations with Alvaro. I'm sure I was not a welcome guest. But we spent time talking about where we were going. And at some point in that part of the time, Mexico, Spain, Venezuela, and Colombia also made life miserable for Alvaro. And so he got all this extra help for free. They were my friends. They were all my friends too, but then, and in some interesting way, we became sort of maybe, if you can use this expression, a fifth wheel in the process, but found it interesting. And I had a deputy who had spent a lot of time in Latin America, Alec Watson. And Alec, in some ways, picked up a good piece of following what was going on. I had never met President Cristiani when I was in El Salvador. It was interesting. And found him here and spent time with him, with Armando and others. Alec worked with what opportunities we had, which were very limited, more on the FMLN side. But we obviously had George H.W. Bush, whose interest was clearly to see whether, in fact, there was more that we could do to keep things moving together. And I think Jim Baker felt very much the same way. It was, on our view, long time that this civil war should end, and that there should be some effort to bring about a peaceful settlement, which Javier and Alvaro in the main were deeply involved in pulling together. And I can't pretend to talk for them or the things that they worked in, but we worked closely with Bernie Aronson, interestingly enough, a Democrat serving in a Republican administration, but very much engaged in wanting to see this process move ahead to a successful conclusion. So I think those were the various pieces that played a role at that time. And I think that as Alvaro brought these to conclusion and had at the final analysis to delay New Year's for a while, it was clearly a massively important achievement for the UN. And it was in that regard, I think, significant that Javier Pérez de Cuellar stayed on until the final events, because he and Alvaro had everything to do with bringing about that kind of a conclusion to the process. It might be interesting too, Jorge, if you want to talk a little bit about what was happening in the Cold War and how and in what way that fit. And Alvaro just told me something that I hadn't known in any detail, that at one point Jim Baker and Sasha Besmirtnik, the then Russian Soviet foreign minister, played a role, obviously, in trying to agilizar the process. But my sense was at the time, because the big preoccupation for me, beginning in the 1st of August 1990, was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, that as the Soviet Union was kind of moving into the past, but had not quite done so, it was nevertheless interesting that the Soviet ambassador left sometime in the early summer, and we had his deputy in charge. A new ambassador had been appointed. Yuri Vorontsov was somebody I had known and worked with over the years. But the deputy was willing, I think, to move in cooperative ways, I think, beyond what maybe he would have ever done under a fully rigorous Soviet system. A Ukrainian Russian, that is a Russian with Ukrainian ancestry, but nevertheless willing to work with us on the process, because Vorontsov took his leave and delayed his arrival until we were quite a ways along in dealing with the Kuwait process in the Security Council. But it was clearly apparent to me that whatever may have been the impressions, and this was 89 and 90, in Central America, it was quite clear that we were working with a changing environment with Russia and with the Soviet Union, and that a number of things we could do together increased quite remarkably, and that we developed a process in the Kuwait question of consulting with each other on a regular basis as resolutions moved through the UN. But it was also very clear that President George H.W. Bush's relationship with Gorbachev and Baker's with Shevardnadze meant that we had plenty of opportunity to have what I would call heavy hitters engaged in whatever we were dealing with that we considered to be very important with the Soviet Union in moving the process ahead. My own sense is that we did little in the course of time I was there, and I'm not sure very much after that, to interrupt the flow of supplies, for example, to FMLN. There was a whole change in weaponry for the FMLN from US M16s, and we knew pretty much where they had come from. A lot from Vietnam, but not exclusively there, to AK-47s, as I remember, and quite modern versions of that. And I think over that period of time as well, it was interesting for me in my time to read documents of the FMLN that had been picked up at various places as a result of fighting, captured documents. And I have to say to Facundo and others in Salvador that the military documents were as good as I've ever seen. They were excellent plans. we got not only the plans, but we got all the changes, which was very interesting to see how and in what way almost up-to-minute accommodations of changes on the ground took place in their planning documents. I have to tell you, with the greatest respect for them, their economic analysis, which we picked up, was pretty awful. It lacked a great deal of what I would call the kind of modern sophistication. But as you know, later, I went to Russia and spent a lot of time, and I knew and understood at least something as to why the insufficiencies of the documentation that I saw in the economic side was part of a process, I suppose, of a relationship. Whether the memory now is of a close relationship or a somewhat distant relationship. But I also have a deep sense that there was a significant amount of Cuban intermediary involvement that may or may not have been affected by the change in the Cold War. But I can't believe in something that the folks in Havana were entirely comfortable with the growing close relationship between the Bush administration and the Gorbachev administration, if I can call it that.
I mean, three things happened pretty much at the same time in that year. The first, of course, was the change in administrations in the U.S., and Bush 41 and Baker taking over, which even though there had been, I guess, some momentum from before in the same direction, the fact of the matter was that different people do different things. The second was in November, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the end of the socialist bloc, which I think everybody saw more or less as the writing on the wall, perhaps not as clearly in El Salvador as in Nicaragua, not as clearly in Nicaragua as in Cuba, not as clearly in Cuba as in Moscow, but still, I think everyone saw it. And the third, of course, was the new final offensive by the FMLN also in November of '89, and of course the execution of Father Yacuria and the other Jesuits, which of these three specific episodes, and I come back to the Cuba question later, I want to come back to that, but which do you think today, with hindsight obviously, was the one that most drove U.S. policy in the direction of, let's get this thing done. It's been dragging on too long. It's possible to do it now. Which one was the most important? By the way, I was going to mention about Bernie Aronson. He was a Democrat working in a Republican administration then. Now he's a Republican working in a Democrat administration. But anyway.
I think he's still a Democrat. You're okay.
I'm not so sure, but he's a good friend and a great guy.
I think that it's a combination of circumstances, and it's hard to pick out one. I will say that George H.W. Bush was interesting. I had one of those moments in my early days in El Salvador when, listening to the radio in my morning shower, I heard that George H.W. Bush was going to Buenos Aires for an inauguration in a couple of weeks. And by then, we clearly had what was a serious death squad upsurge in relation to the offensive that I said began almost the time I got there in September. And so I got on the phone to Bush's chief of staff, who I'd had the pleasure of working with, a former Navy admiral by the name of Murphy. And I said, Dan, we got work for the vice president. Can you get him here when he goes to Buenos Aires? This is what we want him to do. And they did. And so Bush came, and what we wanted him to do was to spend some time with the alto mando of the Salvadoran army. And that his message was very simple. You have to take on the responsibility for stopping the death squad violence. And Bush did that tremendously well. He and I were alone in the room with his interpreter. And we had maybe 30 or 40 colonels and general officers. And Bush's message surprised me. But about the fifth thing that Bush said was, if you keep this up, there is no way that Ronald Reagan or I can convince the Congress not to cut your assistance off entirely. It was that stark. At the same time, before this happened, Alvaro Magana, who was an appointed president in a very weak position, although I thought worked diligently at the job within the very serious limitations he had. But we came to Alvaro and said, we can identify 6 military officers or 5 who have a very bad record and shouldn't be here. Would you appoint those people as attachés somewhere overseas? And for him, it was an enormously difficult problem. I had to go to Vides Casanova and the others and say, Magana is prepared to do this. You've got to give him your support. This is coming up for very bad times, and if you don't do this, we're not going to see much in the future, except obviously a very serious problem with the U.S. And so those two things happen, and I think to some extent they had their own influence, but they had a big influence on George H.W. Bush. So he knew Salvador, he knew what the problem was, he had followed it very closely. And so I think he came into office with the view that this is something that hadn't ended on Reagan's watch, but it had to end on his. I also think that I didn't answer your previous question fully. Ronald Reagan, in my experience with him, and I sat in lots of meetings, including many he had on El Salvador, was not a neocon zealot on El Salvador. I didn't think that he was a neocon zealot on very much. Ronald Reagan had a very interesting style. He knew exactly what he wanted on a number of things, and they were all at 30,000-foot strategy kind of conclusions. And he could articulate those very well, and he had the best group of speechwriters I've ever seen. And he had all of the capacity to present that. But he had an ardent disdain for details. Didn't care. And you know his reputation was that every meeting they gave him a bunch of cards. And he just read these file cards off to whoever it was that was visiting. I've seen him do it. And that if he got the wrong cards, it didn't bother him. And a couple of leaders wondered why they were being talked about some country 7,000 miles away. But it was just the way it operated. But the neocon establishment around him was the motivating and driving force. And many of them were White House people, and some spaced out around in the agencies and the departments. And they were the ones who, if you called it, carried the ball for the dagger pointed at the heart of Texas theory. And those were the people we had to contend with, and that's the reason I wanted to talk to George Shultz before I took the job. I didn't want to have the dagger pass through me on the way to Texas.
Well, but come back to, again, 89, end of 89, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the offensive in El Salvador, the new administration. What most affected your side?
I think
you at the UN.
There's no question at all the murder of the Jesuits had the biggest impact in a real term sense, and I think made it equally, if not more imperative that this happen. Now, General Hamilton has pointed out in a discussion in the earlier panel that Americans in helicopters were shot down, were assassinated, and that kind of, for the U.S., pushed the playing field back closer to the center, but I don't think in any way affected the American public as much as the murder of the Jesuits did. And that was, in that regard, I think, something that in one way or another pretty heavily solidified U.S. interest in doing whatever we could to move that process to some kind of conclusion. That was what, November of 89?
89.
And it took until the beginning of 92 to pull it all together. So it isn't as if, in fact, we had some on-off switch that we could merely push in the White House and out would come some agreement. It was a long and difficult struggle in negotiations. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a huge surprise. And I think everybody took that as the next piece to go in the unraveling of Eastern Europe. I think we saw less that than the imprisonment of Gorbachev in Yalta, the collapse of what I would call the hardline coup, which was what, August 91 or later, and the Yeltsin on the tank outside or in the streets of Moscow for that particular event. And then by the end of that year, Yeltsin was not just the prime minister or the president of the Russian Federation, he was the president of Russia. And between Christmas and New Year's had everybody in, and they all went off independent countries. And that, of course, was the big culmination of the major change. Bush had trouble with Yeltsin because he had thought Gorbachev would be his partner in all of these changes, and Gorbachev disappeared. And he had to deal with Yeltsin, and there was some scratchiness there that they never quite got over together, but nevertheless, it was part and parcel of where things were going.
Did you have a sense once from '89 and most of 1990, when the socialist bloc begins to disintegrate, that the FMLN people were beginning to become more flexible, more willing to negotiate as they saw that their rear guard was simply disappearing? Or did you get this sense either from the Cubans or from the Sandinistas, although that wasn't happening in New York, it was still going on, and I'm sure you read the cables and the rest of the stuff.
My view, Jorge, was that this was a tough negotiation, and that the outside events may have influenced the strategic decisions, but it didn't do as much to influence the tactical decision. But you've got sitting right in front of you the guy who knows this firsthand, and I shouldn't be giving you secondhand reporting on what he knows firsthand.
Well, if you want, whether it's the guy sitting in front or not, who would like to bring up these issues or any one of the many issues that I didn't bring up in this conversation with Ambassador Pickering? Who would like to? A ver, por allá.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Alfonso Diaz. I probably should have been more diligent with my Wikipedia stuff. Did Ambassador Pickering succeed Ambassador White, or was there a gap? And secondly, it depends. When you were the ambassador, El Mozote had already happened, or were you there, and what was your reaction?
Yeah, happily, I was after El Mozote. And it was then known, it was very clear the Salvadoran government was not interested in looking at it. It was also clear that El Mozote was in an area that it was very difficult to get to, because I think it was mainly in FMLN hands most of the time. But there were newspaper stories, obviously, that portrayed what had happened. I think there was some distrust of whether those newspaper stories was true because of the horror of the massacre. I think now it's quite clear that they were, but there was some doubts about that. I was ambassador from September of 1983 till July of 1985, and then I had several successors coming up to the peace agreement.
More, Albert?
Okay. Well, I'm very glad that Tom has made a couple of points about the inherent difficulty of the negotiations, because it dispels the idea that is frequently voiced by essentially uninformed people that this was in effect a proxy war, or purely a proxy war, and that it sufficed that those who were controlling, that the puppeteers should give the orders, and that matters would be worked out. And with the UN in this case being as a sort of conflict fixer, the one who cleans up after the Cold War is over. Actually, cleaning it up was part of ending the Cold War, if anything. I mean, what has, I think, become quite clear in the course of the earlier panels is that there were plenty of intrinsic or inherent problems in El Salvador that led to a war. And in fact, this was acknowledged, I referred to it last night, it was acknowledged by President Cristiani himself, that it wasn't that somebody said, you know, let's complicate things. Somebody in Moscow said, let's complicate things for the US and start to muddy the waters in the US backyard. It wasn't, there were plenty of native reasons that had to be worked out by the natives, which is ultimately what had to happen.
Let me just, Jorge, comment a little further, because I totally agree with Alvaro. And at the time, everything that I knew, everything that I looked at in the history of El Salvador, had everything to do with why there was an armed conflict. We were never in any doubt that there were serious grievances and terrific problems, and that the armed conflict, however one looked at it, had plenty of antecedents that one could see contributing to it. Nobody that I know made arguments about the rightness or wrongness. It was a reality. And in that regard, it had to be dealt with. It was also very clear to me that very early on, as I think I said earlier, this was something that was not going to be clearly turned on by Moscow or turned off by Moscow. There was no switch, nor by Cuba. And that increasingly it was clear that while there was not unanimity among the FMLN, they had plenty of differences and questions to work out among themselves. There was clearly, this was a Salvadoran movement in El Salvador, despite the fact that a lot of people wanted us to believe that it was purely a manipulated movement run from outside of El Salvador and had nothing to do with El Salvador, that the people engaged in it were really, as someone said, maybe you did a moment ago, puppets. And that was not the case, and that was not certainly my view of the situation, nor do I think that that was widely accepted in a lot of places in the United States which looked at it, and that helped to change some of the policies. I think George Shultz was extremely important in getting the policy framework in the right way. And that policy framework was, this is a bad war, it's getting worse, that the problems that have to do with atrocities and human rights violations, so we have to play a major role in trying to work on and bring to an end. We had Americans who were killed not by the FMLN, some were not. We had to deal with that. We had all kinds of things that in one way or another involved a situation that we saw as dangerous and difficult for us as well.
Ruben?
Ambassador Pickering, during the last phase of the negotiation, there was a lot of speculation in our camp that at a certain moment, you, President Bush, and Bernie Aronson, and I don't know if somebody else, were met one night in a dinner in Washington with President Cristiani, and the next day, the problem was solved at the negotiating table. Two questions. One, did this real? And if it is real, could you talk about it?
I think I'd remember such a dinner, Ruben. And as old as I am, I don't recall ever seeing anything like that. But it's quite possible that Bernie, working with President Bush, saw Freddie Cristiani, but I have absolutely no record of it. So you'll have to ask Bernie. And I'm sorry Bernie's not going to be here, but he's doing other things, so.
Sí, yo quería preguntar sobre el tema de los informes sobre violaciones a derechos humanos, si esto fue discutido en algún momento, lo que Estados Unidos tiene sobre esos reportes, si era posible entregarlos como para contribuir con el esclarecimiento de la verdad en el tema de las violaciones a los derechos humanos.
I would say that the reports that we made are probably now almost all available, although I haven't looked, in terms of released material, or could be released on Freedom of Information Act requests. It's now been, what, 25, 30 years, and I suspect that they are. So I think that they could play a role if you think they're valuable. The real problem is that they tend to be mostly hearsay, and so whether in fact they would stand up in a court as opposed to merely an indication of the fact that so-and-so may have been involved in an issue or a problem, I don't know. We had, however, very interesting information from a source who was directly involved in the murder of the 4 churchwomen. And that information, I think, played a very important role in our own pursuit of that case. And that, I think, is indicative that from time to time, we had individuals who either came to us or that we met or saw who had serious inside information on human rights violations and that put themselves in some danger by talking to us about what was going on, and we did our best, obviously, both to protect them, but also to find a way, going back to talk to the Salvadoran government in particular about the question and, you know, what their responsibilities were from our perspective to bring these cases to trial. It was a long and very difficult problem, and it was very interesting, the 2 panels today, how strong and significant the armed forces were in looking after themselves and in dealing with the difficulties that came up within their own context. And quite remarkable, this was something that I had only an inkling of, as to how significant was the change after the peace process. And I was certainly impressed in recent opportunities I've had to visit El Salvador of the changed public attitude toward the armed forces in particular. I think that just to take it one step further, my sense was that absolutely the right thing was done in disbanding the 3 police forces and seeking again with UN help and assistance to train the new ones. However, just to segue to current events, I'm deeply disturbed that that training never included either the problem of dealing with gangs, nor did we in the United States understand that all of the efforts we had made in dealing with the Civil War were going to be totally upset by our own contribution to the gang problem, which was deportations of people from Washington, Los Angeles, and elsewhere who had experience in gangs, who brought that to Salvador, and who brought it into a situation where they had very few other alternatives in terms of dealing with the problem. And I hate to say it, but all of the optimism we've expressed here this afternoon in the various panels about the process and its conclusion is, in my view, totally correct, but not in any way at all sufficient to understand what El Salvador is facing these days and the critical questions that still are out there. And I will say one other thing. It seems to me that dialogue, however disparaged it may be, is an essential element in any country in crisis to be able to find a way to address problems. And problems in that regard are not the sole, obviously, possession of any one group in the society, particularly if things like job creation and investment and economic advancement are critical in playing a role in the resolution of current problems. And while this conference was not about current problems, I don't think any of us could sit here in this hall and not understand that we were talking about a historical period, but we should think about how and in what way in the future your country can find a way through what is, in my view, as tragic a situation as you faced in the past in an entirely different way. But nevertheless, some of the same ideas, processes, and procedures ought to be at least looked at as ways out of where you are now. Again, lesson number one, I never thought a military victory on either side was possible in your Civil War, barring some kind of unexpected event. I, at the same time, don't believe that a purely police solution to your gang problem is the kind of effective answer that you have to use to address a problem that has huge economic and social ramifications. Now, that's all gratuitous, so I'll shut up.
Before I give the floor to George Vickers, just a tiny comment on this, on the Mexican side of this. Many people in the United States, Julia Preston's not here, I don't think, but she's familiar with this, now criticize the Obama administration a little bit less now that they're only deporting criminals, Mexican criminals in the United States and in jail back to Mexico. They're not deporting hundreds of thousands they did the first 4 or 5 years. Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a great idea. Obviously Mexico's a much bigger place, and so no matter, you have to deport a lot of Mexican criminals back to Mexico to make a difference. But the cartels are waiting for them at the border. They're sitting there. They almost have signs up saying, you know, we're recruiting criminals from San Quentin or Sing Sing or someplace like that. If you have, you know how to kill people, knife people, everything, come to us, we need you. It's a stupid idea, and the Salvadorian example is an excellent one of the enormous damage that a policy like that can do.
Well, Jorge, it always has disturbed me. I don't know if somebody turned out the lights for a purpose or not, but it's okay. It's always disturbed me. Why can't we get together and, you know, if we're going to deport people, is there something we can do to retrain? Is there something we can do to suit them for jobs? Is there something we can do to help them when they get back? It's not going to be 100% successful, but I mean, why keep feeding the problem that is making each country in many ways in deeper jeopardy and further down the road to finding an answer to a very difficult problem? And, you know, we don't care. On the other hand, they all learned, put it this way, their malevolent trade in the United States. And we have some responsibility, but I don't think we can do it without cooperation on both sides. And whether it's Salvador, or Guatemala, Honduras, or Mexico, it's got to be something that we have a more common effort to try to resolve.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, but we get PhDs from Harvard, from MIT, and from American prisons.
Yeah.
You know,
exactly.
I'm not sure. I think they.
And I'm not sure which one is worth more than the other, but I can tell you who's making more money.
That's for sure. George, over there, you have.
Well, I didn't want to change the topic back here, but I did want to. You, Ambassador Pickering and Alvaro were agreeing about this notion that it's a mistake to view the Salvador conflict and the role in it as simply as a proxy war between Russia and the United States. I want to push to the second assumption is that the United States actually was such a determining factor in shaping policy. And my question is really, to what extent is it, in your experience in the 80s there and through the negotiations. Was the U.S. really acting with one voice? To what extent you had a U.S. military group there on the ground providing advisors, you had a lot of military support going on, as well as the diplomatic efforts. To what extent did that act in a cohesive way, or to what extent did you have real divisions that reflected themselves in contradictory advice, contradictory influences on the armed forces, on the political actors in El Salvador?
First, on proxy wars, I can't in any way at all move away from the notion that during the Cold War, each side took advantage of difficulties that in one way or another were seen to be a problem for the other side. And so I think that there were, put it this way, patronization of these kinds of questions from a distance. But often, and I think probably nearly exclusively, they had their roots in serious local problems. And as a result, they were, put it this way, opportunities, much as Al-Qaeda has found opportunities for franchising various Muslim groups that have problems in the countries where they live. So I think that's a difficulty. Secondly, there's no question at all that when I arrived in El Salvador, I was at least reassured that the Secretary of State was on the right side as far as I was concerned, or I was on the right side with him, which is probably the more humble way to put it. And that I could get backing if stuff that I saw began to go astray. I had rarely to call on him, and I spent a lot of my life making sure, in fact, that what we were doing fit the pattern of where we wanted to go, and that the responsibility of the military was as much for encouraging good behavior and observance of human rights as it was the rest of the embassy. And I think we had an effect on that. I think George H.W. Bush had a huge effect on it. But, you know, the record is never going to be perfect, and other things went on. I left in July of '85, so I can't tell you much about what went on, but I know my successors, and I know they followed as much as they could the same sort of pattern in dealing with the issues that came up that obviously had, one way or another, the potential for splits. It is also my view that in the life of the Reagan administration, particularly when Secretary Bush came in and then Schultz came in and took an active role in this, the policy became more harmonized and was less, put it this way, discordant and difficult. And I think one of the reasons that President Reagan wanted George Bush was that he'd had too much discord and too much in the way of differences. Now, Iran-Contra happened, and that has its own, put it to genesis, and some of its own possibilities or some of its own difficulties. And some of it obviously took place in El Salvador. Only thing I could tell you was that if I were ambassador under those circumstances and that was going on, I'd find every opportunity I could to stop it. If I couldn't, I'd ask to leave. If I couldn't, I'd leave the service, because it seemed to me that was entirely moving the question in the opposite direction. But those were questions that easy to talk about after the fact, much harder during.
Over here, then over here, then over there, and that might be it. You have the microphone there?
Yes, Ambassador, the ambassador in El Salvador prior to you would not allow the Commander-in-Chief of Southern Command, the four-star SINC, into his country. You and also at the same time, Negroponte, decided that there was some utility to allowing the SINC into your country. Can you tell me what that was? And just as a side note, did you and Negroponte, is it just coincidence that we had probably the two best ambassadors for military cooperation that have ever been in El Salvador at the very same time.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure whether I deserve that compliment or not, but my sense was that I didn't know that Dean Hinton didn't let Paul Gorman come to El Salvador. It never occurred to me that he shouldn't.
Okay, I was blaming White.
Oh, well, Bob White was way before me. And I think by then, Dean Hinton had Paul Gorman coming. Paul Gorman was the U.S. Southern Command commander. And in fact, one of the things that we did, I don't know whether you guys continue it or not, but with the Salvadoran military, we had a monthly meeting. And the morning was that was their turn to tell us what they thought we were doing wrong and what they needed help to fix. And in the afternoon, it was our turn. And we did it in their language, and we did it quite frequently so that it happened. And Paul Gorman came up. Paul, unfortunately, didn't speak Spanish, but his successor did, Jim Gavin. And so we had this sense that those kinds of things were necessary and helpful in dealing with the problem. That the situation, in my view, is that we still don't understand in the United States that if you employ the military, the only purpose is not some massive World War II victory. That may be a purpose, and you have to decide that. But most of what we now are engaged in my view, very unhappily with the failure of the military in Iraq, not their failure, but the failure of the process in Iraq to solve a diplomatic problem, is that we will use military, in my view, when it aids a diplomatic solution, rather than to look at the other way around. And it makes no sense in particularly very difficult regions to introduce foreign forces to try to change the problem. And I have to tell you, I was particularly aided, but I don't know about you, but I thought my mill group commanders were aided by a 55-person limit on American military presence in El Salvador.
Yes, sign up for it.
Kept them away from becoming actively involved in combat. It meant that we had to manage that very carefully, that you had to take people out to get other people in if you needed them. That limit we scrupulously watched because the Congress watched it, but it was not a tool, and in the long run turned out, in my view, to be against interest. I also spent a lot of time with the Joint Chiefs of Staff getting, at least for senior U.S. military people, a 2-year tour. A 1-year tour, the officer spends 6 months learning his job and the next 6 months looking at his next job. And not a very effective way to do things. And I think the ability to be there for a longer period of time and make the commitment, which you did, is an important part of being able to help with those kinds of things. And, you know, 6 months to learn the job is fine, but to do it every year means, in effect, you have half of your military leadership ineffective for half of the time.
Ironically, that 1-year limit, I think, has been a problem in Iraq, but that's not my question. Embajador, it's great to see you. I had the privilege of being in New York when you were there, and I think my former boss would agree if I said that we were very fortunate, the Salvadorans, to have had 2 ambassadors at the UN at the time of the peace negotiations, Ambassador Castañeda and Ambassador Pickering. I wanted to ask you, one of the fascinating things in the panels today has been these sort of golden historical nuggets. And you lived in historical times, both in El Salvador and in New York, and I'm wondering if you could share with us something that probably we don't know about some of the historical characters at the time. I mean, maybe President Duarte, maybe Roberto D'Aubuisson, maybe President Cristiani, or anybody else that you might think of.
Let me just briefly answer that. That gets me into trouble.
It's 35 years later.
35 years later. I have to say that Duarte was in many ways, a pleasure to work with. He had pretty clear ideas what he wanted. I thought he had very poor ideas. He was an equal match for the FMLN in his ignorance of how to organize economic affairs. He was maybe a good match for them in politics. And on the military side, I think he had, as you know, because of his arrest and his previous life, serious problems with the military. But he, put it this way, tightened his belt and tried to work with it because he knew, in fact, that somebody had to make this thing happen if it was going to get out of the mess. But I think his vision all along was Paloma and how to get the process going and see what he could do. And I admired his risk-taking capacity on difficult problems like that. And so in many ways, that was an interesting problem. I will not say the same complimentary things about Roberto d'Aubuisson. We heard from Armando today. I found that shockingly out of keeping with my knowledge of Roberto d'Aubuisson and his way of doing things. I had never met President Cristiani until I met him in New York. I found him also comfortable to work with, and a guy that I felt, as I got to know him, was seriously committed to trying to find an answer for his country of what had been a huge tragedy for everybody. And that I thought his interests were clearly his country's interests. He was a president from the Arena Party, but he never tortured me with any particular question one way or another that reflected anything but a commitment to this national endeavor to try to find an answer to the problem. He was frustrated at times, and at times I think he saw things that he didn't think were going very well, and he was spending entirely too much time in New York. He had his country to run. But I thought through it all, he pulled his weight, if I could put it that way, heavily pulled his weight to make things happen.
Tom, I could have asked you this question in private, but I thought since we are...
I think your microphone's not working.
No, that's what I thought.
Hold it, Prince.
Okay. I could have asked you this in private, but I think for the sake of history, I thought I would ask you in public. As you know, at least some of us in the Secretariat, I was Alvaro's deputy, got the feeling that in Washington they were losing patience with Alvaro and with the negotiations. That the feeling was we had an agreement on human rights, we had made some changes to the Constitution, and here was Alvaro allowing the FMLN to drag on and on and on. And there was an effort, I think, to get the Secretary General, and to some degree the letter by Baker and Shevardnadze was part, a little bit of this. Had that happened, in other words, had there been a different Secretary General, or had there been a different relationship between the Secretary General and his personal representative, it might have meant a change of mediator, or indeed pushing forward without the agreement on the military, which, as we've heard, was actually the most essential. What were your feelings then, and what perhaps you could clarify us a little bit about it?
He's no longer my deputy, so he's not my proxy.
No, and you can speak for yourself, I know very well. I knew about this. I had a sense that having spent time talking to Alvaro, he could handle it very well. And that Alvaro was not going to give way, and that Javier Pérez de Cuellar, who happened also to be a stalwart Peruvian, was not going to give Alvaro away. And so we worked with it. And I think that was kind of a momentary thing that comes up when governments are not too busy and begin to worry about other people's problems and tend to want to resolve them. They jump in this fashion. But I was pleased, in fact, that Javier did the right thing and understood what he could do. And his relationship with the U.S. government was such that he could do it. And there was no blowback on him or on the issue. But I think that Alvaro made this steady progress, but it took a lot of time. And Alvaro was not somebody who could turn switches on and off in San Salvador or with the FMLN to make things happen that weren't going to happen without the necessary negotiation. And I think the value of the negotiation, and indeed the end result, we've talked about it a lot today, was a huge compliment to him, to Javier, and to the UN. And I think that that outcome was critically important, and people who want things bad will get it bad.
Thank you. It's here, Ambassador. It's clear that your comments about Roberto Dawison come from your own experience. I mean, we all know that the U.S. intelligence captured information according to which he was planning to kill you in San Salvador, and that the U.S. had to send Vernon Walters to talk to him. I wonder how you dealt with Mr. Dawison. I mean, the fact that he was protected here by people from Congress, like Senator Jesse Helms and people in the Pentagon and maybe people on the CIA, did you ever feel in the State Department that not everybody in Washington was singing the same song when it came to Mr. Dawison? And how did you deal with him after that?
I think as little as possible. I'm not sure, in all honesty. I knew the reports, I read the reports, how really serious they were. Washington tended to feel they were serious. They had an unusual attention. I suppose that we'd lost a few ambassadors. They didn't want to lose another one. So Dick Walters came down. Actually, Jesse Helms came down and talked to Dawison. I don't know what exactly he said, but because he was not my greatest fan. So yeah, but it was not a happy time. I suppose I could have taken some satisfaction that I was equally a target on both sides in El Salvador. Maybe there was some genius in my way of behaving that produced that kind of result.
Have one last question, perhaps right over there. Yep, go ahead.
As I remember it, 1983 to 85 was when the U.S. very successfully consolidated support, massive military aid and economic aid to the Duarte government, and that was when you were ambassador. But at the same time, the Contra War was going south. The Boland Amendment, which from my perspective is an extremely important, one of the rare occasions in which Congress has unequivocally said, no, you may not do what you want, and we know what it led to. So what I wanted to ask was, I mean, these two countries right next to each other, you and I believe Negroponte was the ambassador, how did those deliberations, Congress, the Boland Amendment, that weight coming in, how did that affect what was happening, I mean, policy making in El Salvador? How did it shape the options? And you've already referred to Vice President Bush coming and giving his quite famous warning to the senior officers. But in a larger sense, how did the Boland Amendment shape what you were trying to do?
Well, look, I think that with a few exceptions, almost everybody in El Salvador had enough to do dealing with El Salvador. And they were not, in that sense, deeply concerned. There was clearly a deep sense that the Sandinista logistics system, or the FMLN logistics system that certainly came out of Nicaragua, was a real problem. But they were not in a position to deal with that. And we were not in a position in an active way, I think, to deal with that. And it was highly successful. I have to ask Facundo to come and see the CIA to make sure we have all his secrets so that if we have to do that someplace else, we know how to make things run. And so there was not an enormous preoccupation, nor did I think in that period of time was there a feeling that the silver bullet was to cut off the logistics, that it was better, that they had to deal with the problem that was there. It was in their backyard. And they knew pretty well that logistics shortages would not make a major difference in the outcome, much as maybe they hoped that something could be done that would change that. But Doña Violeta, when she became president, was not able to deal with the problem in Nicaragua in terms of where things were going. So I think that the truth was that things shifted, but it didn't make a difference, nor with the Contras. And in the end, the whole Contra thing turned out to be bad decisions at bad times with bad partners. Other than that, it was simply splendid.
There's still two more over here, Cynthia and President Calderon.
Gracias. Okay. Tom, thanks very much for this very forthcoming presentation. I wanted to thank you for the role that you played in 1983 when you became ambassador, because I think it was very clear to those of us that were working on the Hill and that had worked, for many years. There go the lights again. Time to shut up.
That's all right, Cynthia. You can make the lights go out anywhere. Just
right.
keep talking. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very kind. Oh, my God. That there was a qualitative change in the attitude of the U.S. Embassy around human rights issues, and the visit by Vice President Bush in December of '83 was a direct result of things that you pushed for and cared about at a time that death squad violence was actually going up before the '84 elections. The declassified documents that were released in the early 1990s in the United States as a result, or after the Salvador Truth Commission report came out, and then the Clinton administration released a lot of material, demonstrate that there was, at least initially, a decline in death squad killings, but then there are a number of documents, mostly on the intelligence side, that say that the Salvadoran government did nothing except cosmetically change a few people, that they're resisting, and that this is not going away. And so I was wondering if you could comment on, I mean, it was seen as a very clear, important moment in U.S. policy, and yet the internal record, quite distinct from what was said publicly, is it not a whole lot changed? So from your perspective in the embassy, what did that period look like?
Yeah, Cynthia, from my perspective, during the succeeding sort of 18 months that I was there, we did not see and record from our records a big increase. Indeed, we saw a serious download, if I could put it this way, in that period of time. I don't argue that at some point it did increase. And I don't know when or why or who was involved, but it was a preoccupation of many Salvadorans that if this was all-out war, they would conduct all-out war and do it against the civilian population. And again, how they chose people to kill and what information they used and all the rest is entirely a black box. But that was, I guess, their reason for starting it. But I think it was a disastrous policy, and it undermined the relationship with the U.S. in a very serious way. And my sense was that Bush certainly, for my time, had an enormous effect. And I think nobody wanted to toy with the idea that neither Reagan nor George Bush was in a position to stop the Congress if that's where the Congress was going to go. And that was certainly an idea that a lot of Congress people had, aided and encouraged by a lot of people in the United States who didn't like the war, didn't like the government, and didn't like what they were doing.
Sí, yo quisiera hacer esta aclaración, porque oí la situación de la acusación de Roberto Dawison hacia el embajador Pickering. Eso se dio en el contexto de la campaña presidencial del presidente Duarte, que adversaba a Dawison. Y esa situación fue alguna desinformación que ha de haber llegado a la embajada, porque no hubo una prueba, Roberto Dawson estaba sometido a una desinformación periodística permanente. Fue retratado como Idi Amin. Era algo monstruoso. Entonces, el hecho que en el contexto de la campaña se dijese que el embajador Pickering podría ser asesinado, fue una acción de desinformación, y yo me recuerdo que tal vez se recordará el embajador Pickering, que se reunió con Dawison en la casa de mi padre, en su casa, en la casa de mi padre, porque era increíble la acusación, esa noticia que se había filtrado en la prensa y que se había dado en el contexto de la campaña electoral. Dawison había ayudado al Estado de Derecho, había sido expresidente, era expresidente de la Asamblea de Constituyente. Tuvimos constituyente en el 83, la Constitución, y él había sido presidente de la Constituyente. Entonces, yo creo que eso fue una parte de injusticia contra Dawison y con la información. Yo estuve cerca de él y muchos en el partido estuvimos muy cerca de él y no era capaz de semejante cosa. Así que lo aclaro porque la verdad que sí fue una noticia filtrada.
Señor Presidente, con mucho respeto, no era así. Let me just explain. The information came from a highly confidential source who had proven in prior reports that his information came from very close inside D'Aubisson's circle and had proven to be true through the past. So we had reason to believe that it had veracity connected with it. It was not a product of misinformation or an electoral gambit. That while I had my doubts that it may have been entirely the case that it wasn't a group of people sitting in a bar talking, as opposed to a group of people seriously planning. Nevertheless, I did not believe that it was something that Duarte's people had arranged to put before us that was clearly designed to try to help him in his electoral campaign. I think that's a canard and not true. And my own sense is that I met several times, but not more than several times, with Roberto D'Aubisson. I can't remember, but do not believe I had met with him after this event, except maybe casually in a social occasion. It was not my business not to pursue him for a meeting, nor was it my business to avoid him if we met socially. But I had early on in my days in El Salvador, perhaps in my third or fourth day, invited him to the residence to have a conversation, because I've always felt that you can't be an effective ambassador without having an opportunity to know and speak with everybody in the country concerned, with very rare exceptions. And that was my attitude toward him and toward what he was doing. My own sense was that it was very clear that he was directly supported by Jesse Helms' staff. I won't say by Jesse Helms, but I can't imagine his staff would be down in El Salvador speaking with him in his election campaign on the platform with him to audiences in El Salvador without having him obviously convey a different view of American policy. And that, I think, is my best explanation of both the question of who was supporting whom and in what way in the election. There is no question, because it's a matter of record, that the United States provided financial support to Duarte's campaign, in large measure because it felt that overwhelming financial support on the other side somehow had to be equalized, and it was not going to come from inside El Salvador.
Pues, thank you all very much. Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. Thank you for joining us. Please, Ambassador, a hand. I'm told there's a reception or something outside. So.